everyone, it's Amy Sheffer with Paper Tray Ink. I'm here today with this week's Make It Monday video and challenge. Today I'm going to be showing you a way that you can achieve brush lettering, watercolor brush lettering, using your stamps and some extra shading with ink and a paintbrush. Let's get started. The first thing that you'll need is some sort of sentiment image that has a nice brush stroke quality to it. This new Paper Clippings Thank You by Betsy is perfect. It's big. There's a lot to color here, but it's got the perfect script font here that will work well with this technique. You can choose something smaller if you want to kind of get started on a smaller scale first. You'll also need 2 shades of a color, any color. I've worked with Lovely Lady and Raspberry Fizz for today. You'll need a small amount of water. I just have a little tray here. And then a paintbrush and some watercolor paper. I'm using a number 4 round brush for today. You can experiment with larger brushes, smaller brushes, and just kind of see what works best for you. A lot of it's going to depend on the thickness also of your stamped letters. First thing that you'll want to do is stamp your image or your sentiment in the lighter of the 2 colors, or the lightest of the colors. You can certainly use more than 2. Okay, so now I have the image stamped in Lovely Lady. Don't worry too much about the quality of the stamping here. Sometimes it's hard to get a solid image on watercolor paper, and you don't need to worry about that because we're just going to paint right over it anyway, so all that is going to kind of disappear. Okay, so I'm going to get a piece of palette paper here, and we're going to use Raspberry Fizz ink as our painting medium. I'm just going to smush a little bit here on this palette paper. You could use an acrylic block or a craft sheet, whatever you have that will work. And now when you start the brush lettering, the faux brush lettering, you're going to want to think about the individual letter strokes. So when a brush calligrapher would paint this, they'll pick up the paint, the pigment, they'll start their stroke, and when the paint runs out, then they'll go, or starts to run out, then they'll go pick up some more pigment. So that's why you get the darker shade at the beginning of the letter strokes, and then it lightens up as you go. So kind of think as you're painting where the brush letterer would, the brush letter calligrapher would be starting and stopping the different strokes. So for example, I'm going to say that the first stroke is probably from the base of this T, this little flourish here, all the way around the loop-de-loop up to the top of the H. And then at that point, I don't know, because I'm not a brush letterer, but I think I'd be picking up some more pigment right here to come down on this downstroke of the H. I would also pick up more pigment for the downstroke of the T. So be thinking about that, and those are the places where you're going to concentrate your color at the beginnings of each of those strokes. So the first thing that I like to do is to go ahead and moisten the brush strokes one at a time. And you want not too much water. You're really just trying to kind of moisten that paper. You really shouldn't see any puddles of water on the paint surface. You're really just kind of wetting that stamped line. So I'll start at the bottom here. I work my way all the way around to the top of that loop on the H. Now you can start picking up your Raspberry Fizz ink or whatever your darker color is and start painting in the darker color, concentrating the bulk of the color here at the beginning of the brush stroke. So you see that? And then you kind of come all the way around and lift and stop up here at the top of that H. Now I personally kind of like a lot of contrast between the beginning and the end of the brush stroke. So I'm going to add more color, more of my darker color down here at the base. Now if you're not happy with the way that your rest of your color looks, you could certainly smush some Lovely Lady on here as well and use that for the second half of the stroke. Then you're going to move on to the second brush stroke or whatever. I mean, you could skip all around if you wanted to. I'm going to just finish up this down line of the H, and then I'll go back and get my T. The size of your paintbrush is going to kind of determine how quickly this process goes. If you feel brave and you want to use a really thick brush, you might be able to just get your water on with one stroke. I'm not that good at that. So I prefer to use a smaller brush and kind of, paint it on that way. So essentially these letters, these stamped letters, become your guide, and you're just tracing or coloring right over them. And that kind of takes the guesswork out of forming the letters, and you can really focus on achieving the look of the brush lettering, even if you don't really like the way your own handwriting looks or your own ability to do the brush lettering. So there's probably a little bit too much water here. If that happens, you can just use the corner of the paper towel to kind of blot up some of that water. So here would be the beginning of another stroke, right here at the top of that T. And if you start getting a lot of water, you might see some feathering, and that would be an indication you might have too much water on your paper. So I'm just going to do the same method all the way along the rest of the sentiment. As you can see, if you choose a smaller sentiment, you'll be done a lot quicker. I think these larger sentiments, though, are really dramatic, and they remind me so much of, intentionally, I'm sure, they remind me so much of the brush lettering artwork that you see. My Instagram feed is loaded with it. I must subscribe to a lot. Okay, so I'm just going to do this very same technique all the way through the whole sentiment. I'll speed it up so you don't have to sit through it quite as much. Okay, enjoy. So while you're watching this, I wanted to share a couple of other ways that you can achieve a similar look. One would be to stamp on watercolor paper just like this, but instead of using a paintbrush, you could use markers to do the shading, and then come back in with a brush and water to do the blending. And then another option is to stamp regular ink on white cardstock and use your Copic markers to do the blending in much the same way that you would blend any other image. Some people, I think, feel more comfortable with markers, and so that's another option to try if you're not comfortable with the paintbrush and the water. So this is a look at the before and after, so you can see what we've done with the brush lettering. And now we're ready to turn this into a card. First, I'm going to do some ink blending around the perimeter using Harvest Gold ink. Then I'm going to add a green parakeet pretty frame, just the outside portion. And last, I'll add some floral clusters. The flowers, sentiment, and the bird all come from Paper Clippings Thank You. The flowers are stamped in Blueberry Sky and Enchanted Evening. The bird is in Aqua Mist. The leaves come from Bloomin' Cute and are stamped in New Leaf. And the sentiment is stamped in Enchanted Evening. I adhered the frame, floral clusters, and sentiment, and then added a few sequins for extra embellishments. The card front is mounted onto a top fold A2 New Leaf card base, and that completes the card. I hope you're inspired to give this technique a try, either with a paintbrush and ink pads or with markers. Thanks so much for joining me today. I can't wait to see what you do with the faux brush lettering technique.